Welcome to Hear From Where, a podcast about the journeys that shape us. I'm your host, Chef Andrew Garrett, and each week I'll sit down with incredible individuals who've carved their own paths in health, nutrition, entrepreneurship, sports, and beyond. This is where we dive deep into the stories of determination, resilience, and passion, the moments that brought them here, from where they started. Whether you're looking for inspiration, a spark to start your own journey, or just love hearing amazing stories, then you're in the right place. So grab your favorite drink, settle in, and let's explore what it really takes to follow your dreams. Hello and welcome to episode 9 of Hear From Where. I'm your host, Chef Andrew Garrett, and today I am joined by Graham Christensen, who is a fifth-generation family farmer from Nebraska. His family farm is transitioning towards regenerative farming practices. He is also the co-founder of Regenerate Nebraska. Graham, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm excited to share your story. I've gotten a good handful of information from you just playing ball there in Vegas. And now I'm excited to get deeper into the history of everything you guys do. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. Good times in Vegas, and it was fun to catch up on some of these topics and play a little ball together. So yeah, I've been looking forward to diving into the conversation with you.
Absolutely. So where are you guys located at Nebraska?
Northeast Nebraska. It's about an hour north of Omaha, or between Omaha and Sioux City, Iowa. About 15 miles west of the Missouri River. A stone's throw from the Iowa state border.
Okay, sweet. And what kind of acreage are you guys farming?
We farm about 800 acres. It's a pretty fertile area, lifted up just kind of out of the lowest hills off the Missouri River Valley. Has a lot of the dirt that was brought in. Apparently, it was brought in by glaciers long time ago.
That's awesome. The Willamette Valley out here in Oregon has some of the most amazing soil on the planet because of the great glacial flood that happened 15, 20,000 years ago and carved out the Columbia River Gorge. And then the water all hit the coastal range, and then all that silt just settled right in the Willamette Valley. So like yourself, I think that those glacial floods really created something really special in places where you're at and where I'm at. So what are you guys growing out there?
We're doing a lot of different things, but our primary cash crops would be non-GMO white corn. And then we're also really working hard to try to, more perfect a system for non-GMO food grade beans. Would typically be used for tofu. But we're trying to learn on that non-GMO side how to better do the weed control scenario on the beans. Especially the corn's been fairly easy transition for us. And then, we're intercropping a whole bunch of different kinds of small grains or other various legumes and brassicas into the system. And something we talked about also is that we're doing a lot more experimentation with agroforestry or different kinds of tree species that produce fruits or nuts or more brushy type trees that would incorporate different kinds of berries. So over the last 15 years, we've just been infusing a bunch of those into the system to see what it takes. And that led to a small hazelnut orchard and large plantings of, at least for us, our farm, large plantings of pecans and a couple different kinds of cherries, including black cherries as well, which are not yet ready to be taken to market. And we don't have the exact plans for that yet, because of one of the reasons, things we talked about when we were playing baseball. There's a lack of market access out here for more of those food grade agroforestry opportunities. But we're learning because we love it, and it's good for us, and it's good for the animals and the soil at very least. And hopefully we'll figure out how to spend some markets for these kind of things in the future.
Heck yeah, that's awesome. Now I don't know if you're aware of this, but Oregon produces 2/3 of America's
Mhm.
hazelnut crop.
Yes,
So
sir. I'm
you be
aware. I follow.
careful. I there's some market share there, but I don't want to give away too much of a our big market.
Yep, yep. No, I'm aware. I'm aware of the hazelnuts. I've done some studying or reading up on, how Oregon's been involved with that, and also on the East Coast. And then I was also influenced by friends in the kind of upper Midwest and Minnesota through Wisconsin, especially, who were doing hazelnuts and have started to, I guess, strum up some more market connections there. And it fits real good in recreating kind of habitat for especially chickens, but
Huh.
other kinds of animals as well.
All right. Now I jumped over what it did. We just jumped right into like the real deal, and that's on me. You are a fifth generation farmer. So a fifth generation farmer means that your family goes back to what? That's got to be the late 1800s.
Yeah, so we would have homesteaded the land that we farm on now in 1867. Yeah, and my brother and I are the fifth or fourth sons of Christian. Christian Christensen was an immigrant from Denmark. They were feeling pressures from the monarchy over there, not able to farm, independently, and so ended out in the U.S. and eventually a couple Danes ended out homesteading in this northeast Nebraska area. 1867, I think, early July is when they first stepped. Right around July 1st is when they first stepped foot onto the land.
That's amazing. I mean, not only that you can follow your family history that far back, but also to have that kind of history in the ground that you're working.
Mhm.
And over those generations, so the Christiansens made it there. They found this amazing soil. You're right next to the Missouri River, which is a great river that's super healthy, flows well. I'm sure there's plenty of flooding that happens out that way. Um, they started farming or homesteading. At what point do you know what at what point like they started pushing more towards like the grander farming aspect of it?
Mhm. Yeah, they got into it right away. The kind of old wise tale is that they, were kind of dropped off, and then they headed to the west. They heard there's some fertile land there, and they stopped to camp the night that, or where in the location where they found the tallest grasses, and they just assumed that it would be the most fertile area. And but the Homesteading Act, it had provisions in it that required them kind of immediately to set up some lodging, maybe some other kind of buildings or structures within a short period of time. And it also to be able to retain that land for farming. It also required other provisions that at in a certain amount of time, and even within year one, that they would be growing some stuff on that land. And so the books that kind of recall some of the history that about this plight or about this journey showed that within the first summer that they were putting in some small grains and harvesting a small batch, and then they just kind of kept expanding that over the next several years of their initial kind of landing in northeast Nebraska.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I too can track my family back to the early 1800s and when they came from Wales to
Mhm.
Canada to the U.S. And there's something I think that there's a huge disconnect in general American familiar history that we don't necessarily have the ability, even though that the ancestral and the familytree.com stuff, like
Mhm.
knowing where you came from and knowing the work that went into what you're working towards now, like that's got
Mhm.
to be so fulfilling for you.
Oh, absolutely. So those principles of why Christian and Ole Larson was his counterpart, that ended up here, especially Christians, trying to find that opportunity to farm independently, to have more meaning. That inspires kind of us using regenerative ag to try to I guess regain that kind of business independence that has been so influenced on the farm, in modern times. And then just knowing all the work they put in, to restart, their scenario. it's really inspiring and admirable, and it means something, and makes us just want to try to, I guess, work to improve that land, but to carry on that tradition. It definitely was one of the things that influenced my kind of thought processes as I was, contemplating moving back and getting involved in farming again, along with the opportunity to be an ecological solution and produce food.
Heck yeah, dude. That is so cool. Now, you say regenerative farming. Now, regenerative farming is something that is relatively new to the pop culture scene where folks are talking about regenerative. I like for folks that don't know what regenerative is, self included, is like, what does that really encompass? Because to me, like, it sounds like your ancestors were practicing these really super uh, earth friendly, nature friendly, like cooperative crops, and so at some point as Americans we started farming industrially, and then we're coming back around to doing this in a more uh, holistic way, I guess. What? Yeah, I guess my question is, what is regenerative farming?
It's a good question. I'm really, really glad you asked that. Thank you. I just kind of want to like take a step back to and expand upon the initial moment, like where our ancestors, kind of first put foot onto this area. There were indigenous peoples of the Omaha tribe. The first morning they woke up camping in that area in the middle of the summer. That were there to greet them, and it was a big surprise, as you can imagine. To have five Omaha, just sitting there as they woke up, and so they were startled. But the Omaha had treated them well, broke bread for them, but that asked that they would not farm or homestead where their growing area was, which so we ended up going just directly to the south of that area. But the indigenous people, they were really the last culture in the North American continent that was, thriving and surviving in a way that worked within the ecosystem instead of manipulating the ecosystem. And so our initial ancestors learned how to be on the prairie in large part, and that inception from them. They had influence, and so there's been a lot of twists and turns over the four generations since them. But we're trying to step back into that kind of mindset where we're working with the ecology and within the surrounding ecosystem instead of trying to re-engineer it. And our farm had been part of trying to maybe too much re-engineer the system that we were in, and we were seeing some failures start to happen. So getting to the definition of using that as a foundation to get to the definition of regenerative agriculture. There's a lot of talk about how do you define this? What is it? Is it different than organic? And you hear squabbles, and I just feel like that's kind of what the big industry would want us to argue about these things. But what is becoming more widely accepted and how we define it to ourselves is through a set of principles, and there's six primary principles, with the seventh being that it's is structured or founded in this indigenous wisdom mindset. The six outside of that would be number one. We're in the prairies, so we're minimizing the tillage of the land for starts. Every now and then you got to flat out something or disc up something that's been compacted, but for the most part we don't till any of the ground anymore. So that's the first one. The second one is that you want to try to, even in a northern climate like Nebraska, you want to have permanent roots in the ground like the prairie would, right? So having a root structure in the ground all year, and that also stops the dust from flying around or more severe water erosion. And of course, we had a recent storm here, big blizzard, our last blizzard of the year, at least I hope. And that bottom layer that was about a half inch thick, and then there was almost 10 inches of snow on that. But when we scooped that out, or on the roof of our house, was caked in this orange, kind of dust, and that came from New Mexico and West Texas through this wind, and then we got the precip part, so we had to kind of scoop off that layer as well. So the soil's moving again. We're seeing dust bowl activities in cross parts of the area. We're getting dust from those areas through these monster storms, and so you want to have that permanent root structure, so you're stopping that dust from being able to move around so easily. The third principle is after you have those permanent roots in the ground, you want to continue that process so that you're actually developing soil armor. Think of it as when you go to bed at night and it's cold, you put a blanket over yourself to kind of have some temperature regulation and stay warm. Soil armor with that extra, permanent roots you have in the ground, that's your blanket for the soil. And so it temperature controls in the most extreme climates like Nebraska has, or, we all have different extremes in different ways, but it helps us regulate and keep kind of that soil warm during the coldest spells we have of the winter. And it helps keep it cool and shaded, and covered during the hottest times of the year. So soil armor is that third principle. The fourth principle is with all this permanent roots and soil armor is increasing biodiversity. So looking to add as much different kinds of diversity in plant species around the areas as possible. And so always looking to create that means you're creating new habitat for beneficial insects and pollinators and birds when you increase that biodiversity. With all that biodiversity and roots and permanent roots and armor, the next principle, the fifth one, that is livestock integration. So now think about how the buffalo once roamed across the North American continent. They're doing the cyclical grazing kind of cycles. Think about Africa with elephants and giraffes and other ruminant animals moving across. They had a huge role in being able to maintain a well-balanced ecosystem. And now that we've removed the animals and are using more synthetic nutrients instead of their natural processes, including their waste from the grazing and the eating, we're running into ecological issues. And while I understand that it may be hard to just let the bison go roam across the whole North American continent in the way that it once was, on our farms, we could be emulating that same kind of cyclical system, bringing ruminants back in and helping more maintain, the ecology of the area with those permanent roots, soil armor, and extreme biodiversity that you've now implemented back into the farm. On our farm, we're really good at all of those, but we're not as good at livestock integration because our family sold all our livestock when we were very young, my brother and I, who manage the farm now. So we're just working with neighbors and trying to find out how we can slowly reintegrate the animals in, but that'd be our weak spot. But we kind of know where we need to get better at. And so we will strive to be better in the future. And then the sixth principle is ecosystem context. So you're up in Oregon and I'm in Northeast Nebraska, and our climates and our soils are different. So some of the things that I choose to grow here aren't going to work very well in Oregon. They're definitely not going to work in the desert Southwest and like Vegas or Arizona, some of those areas that that we're playing and watching ball in, and New York's going to be different than where we're at. Even in Nebraska, there's a lot of difference and variation of growing climates and soil types. So the sandhills of Nebraska are completely different than what we are experiencing in Northeast Nebraska. So I want to plant stuff that is more meant to be here, more natural to our ecosystem, and use that into a working system instead of planting something that doesn't make any sense or could be invasive or is just not native to the area. And then you're using practices that also allow that to happen instead of disrupting the context of the ecosystem. And then that seventh is indigenous wisdom. The circle, the six principles are only held tight when we keep that in mind and making sure that we're working within the ecosystem instead of actually trying to re-engineer or disrupt the ecosystem, which modern ag is kind of taken more of that direction. But we need that indigenous wisdom to be able to hold this true. And so that's how I look at defining regenerative agriculture as a principled method. And then when you look at it that way, you don't have the fights between organic and regenerative either, because regenerative offers a route towards organic. And if you can at the top marry organic and regenerative, then in my opinion, you're a better farmer than myself, because I'm not quite there yet. That's the goal. That's the holy grail of farming, is when you marry those two. And of course, you have all those kind of beneficial things that are now taking place, and you're working on ecosystem restoration and therefore the term regenerative agriculture. You're regenerating.
That's amazing. Right? That is the most wonderful explanation that I have heard. And I am really excited that I got to have this because I got to write it all down. And so I'll actually remember these things. That's an absolute trip to me. So I grew up on a farm. We didn't start the farm. My father was a caretaker there. Um, but I was around it, and we grew fruit trees. And in Northern California, where I was at, like stone fruits were the go to. Like we did apricots, cherries, peaches, nectarines, and then we also had a plethora of berries. But again, Snow Valley being a really fertile place that was really easy to grow. I really love that you guys are. I'd like I like the idea of having more than just, we're just growing soybeans across 800 acres. We're growing this plot here, and we're going to grow some hazelnuts here. We're going to do some cherries here. We're going to grow this other tree or this other plant here. What are some of the other indigenous plants that exist on the farm for you guys, and how do they impact your overall farming practices?
Yeah. Well, so most of my life I've kind of walked, with just like I would say almost my head in the clouds, thinking of ways to do stuff and not knowing or quite appreciating what was like right under my feet. And so as we've tried to rewild some of our areas little by little, I've seen some things like propagate back up naturally that were more native to here. And so examples with that would be like elderberries, wild plum. We do naturally have some black cherries, but a lot of them had been kind of eradicated in the area. So we wanted to reinfuse those. I've seen things like a lot of different kind of plants, like the prairie rose, for example, which was used by indigenous peoples for medicinal purposes. Pop back into the scene very naturally. Of course, there are a ton of those kind of prairie flowers that would have fit into that regiment. They were better at using things like cedar trees for medicinal properties, even incense type qualities. And so, of course, the red cedar tree right here is considered, a plague or a pest to most folks, and they are, they do can take over a place, if you don't manage that. But there's also a lot of benefits that can come with that as well, and those even other things like being natural windbreaks and stuff that's like very resilient to our wild weather that we have in the middle of the country. We're all purposes of these things, so it goes beyond the food and medicinal. It even goes to just like being able to have like how you shelter yourself or protect yourself from those extremities. So a lot of those things, hazelnuts, wild varieties of hazelnuts have been found in along waterways in north central Nebraska, along the Niobrara River specifically, that are attributed to being native species that indigenous people would have, gathered along the route, quite some time ago. And so these are all things that are influencing us, and then we're trying to, figure. And then actually in southeast Nebraska, the pawpaw tree, which is kind of like this weird mix of a banana and a cantaloupe, is an exotic fruit. But who knows? Like, Lewis and Clark wrote about it, and if you talk to the Iowa tribe, they have some like of those forests still remaining right along the Missouri River in southeast Nebraska, and so we've been looking at how to kind of integrate some of those, as well. So the sky's the limit. Trying to read more and understand more about what was here, that I'm not seeing now, that I can repropagate back, or things that I should look for that were used for all these different purposes successfully, before we started into the modern medicine cycle.
That is amazing.
Super
I,
cool.
I,
I'm
I
in such
it,
a discovery,
it,
like process, personally at this age.
yeah. I mean, it to I. So there was a lot of things that we've done throughout the history of uh, industrialization of America, and one of the things that drives me most nuts is the eradication of anything that our ancestors found uh,
Yeah.
invasive. And so something like the red cedar, where it has all these benefits, and if it was just, and you nailed it, is like if it was just managed
Yeah.
appropriately, it would have been it would be something that's so beneficial to the
Different work.
world,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? I love to hear that that is a big principle in what you guys are doing. Um, when you when you look at the soil at your farm versus some like giant industrial farm, because so as a chef and nutritionist, like
Mhm.
I'm always thinking about what my plants are eating, because what my plants eat or what I eat, and the same thing goes for animals. That's why I really love to hunt. I think that, being able to harvest my own food is huge. I buy beef. When I buy beef, I buy it from a local farmer. It's all grass fed. They're doing, full cycle, pasturing. They're going all around. Um, what, where was I going with this? The nutrients in the soil. So with regenerative farming practices, it sounds like there's going to be a whole lot more nutrient density in the soil versus something that's just being overcropped and overcropped and overcropped, tilled and plowed, chemicals, chemistry, lab, uh, nutrients. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it unfortunately is. So, modern agriculture, and once again, we were a part of this. You would be seeking more monocrop type, plantings, I guess. So, as corn and soybeans, primarily in our area. As the soil's depleted, we as farmers have become more reliant on synthetically produced, nutrients, and so what we're seeing as you've taken away the biodiversity and you kind of have the bare soil with just those monocrops is that the nitrates, byproduct of the nitrogen fertilizer, they don't bind very well, so they work their way through the soil down into our underground water reservoirs, and we're in the Midwest, and Nebraska is definitely a part of this. We're seeing high nitrates in our water, which creates more risks for cancers. A condition called blue baby syndrome that really infects infants and their like baby calves and stuff like that, because their oxygens can't soak up enough oxygen essentially at the cellular level. Their cells can't, and so they they essentially suffocate from the inside. This is a farmer's general definition of that, not the most scientific, but that's what happens. And so that's too much of a nutrient, right? Some nutrient good, too much is bad, and so when it gets in our waterways and we're uptaking it, it's creating these problems. We've done a kind of recent analysis on phosphorus, which is another important nutrient. It more binds, and so when we have heavy rain events and it's just bare soil, it kind of runs into the above ground waterways. And back to the nitrogen also is that the creation of that releases more nitrous oxide through the development of synthetics. And nitrous oxide, you have your carbon dioxide emissions on the increase, but nitrous oxide's been on the increase for years too, and it's a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2 is, and so something else that we kind of got to consider into the ecological side of things. But the point of regenerative is to use those animals in that more biodiverse setting to recreate more of those nutrients for you. So you use less nutrients, less, you have to purchase less of the synthetics. And the best farmers, once again, that are at that top end are doing so good with their animals moving through these cycles that they're able to replace almost all of their inputs. In many cases they are replacing all of their inputs with the guys that are best. We're not there yet. We're still supplementing with synthetics, but like one of our primary goals is to continue to whittle that down. We've been working on it already, but into the future, and try to get to that position that's a lot closer to where those really, really good farmers are, who are great practitioners of those regenerative principles. So the nutrients, the development of these synthetic nutrients are causing more problems. There's starting to be a growing awareness of those problems, and the regenerative cycle can directly address those problems. Unfortunately, what I'm seeing is big ag and big tech are now in the game of using CRISPR gene editing to engineer like weird new microbes and introduce them to soil to try to do some of these things that a healthy soil would do. And we're sitting here saying, I don't know, that hasn't been tested long enough to know like if this is proven, or if what the overall impacts will be to the future generations, let alone ourselves. But maybe we should just start with the 6 regenerative principles and help the farmers, be able to transition safely into those principles and start with that and see. And what we would see is profound impacts, most certainly, that would halt the movement of the soil in most cases. And that would mean that if the soil is moving, we're not losing as much of those nutrients into the water supply, as well as other contaminants that are applied, pretty widespread on the chemical side of things for a lot of farms that are out there. So just start with the principles, and I think like a lot of our problems would go away. And then after that, we can maybe talk about if this other stuff's good for the long term. I'm not so sure it is.
I it it never ceases to amaze me the lack of uh, agreement on symbiotic relationships in nature
Yeah,
and how important they are to us as humans existing. Like it hurts me, but it also is laughable to me that instead of looking at this thing that's been done for thousands of years, like this is what works and it's worked.
yeah,
And oh no, we could create that in a lab. Like
yeah,
let's just get crazy. Hear me out. It I just For me, farming is one of those things where technology has really started to set us back in a lot of ways because we are able to, you know, produce this huge crops in the 60s and 70s, I would imagine. And now we're starting to see the decline of those crops where you're not able to do it because you don't have the actual nutrients that soil really craves or wants.
yep,
Growing up, I had a friend who, their family had cows, they had horses, they had chickens, they had turkeys, they had ducks. And what they would do is the cattle would pasture in one area for a significant amount of time, and then they would move the cattle, and then they'd, bring their chickens and their ducks and their turkeys over onto the pasture where the cows were. Their eggs, like I had never seen eggs with yolks so orange.
yeah,
And they weren't raising these chickens to be the 4 or 5 pound birds that we see in the store today, but they were, essentially what's called a game hen, where it was just a short lifespan, where it was 1 or 2 pound bird. But it
hmm,
was unlike any chicken I've ever eaten in my entire life. And it was just, it didn't make sense to me until I started looking at like how farming practices exist today. And what it turned out is that the cows would turn over the soil, and then they would excrete their cow dung, and then the birds would come over, and all those worms, all those maggots, all those,
hmm,
small little tiny pieces of protein that birds crave, they eat all those, and then they excrete their feces, and then
hmm,
that helps fertilize the soil so the
right.
grass grows back, and then the cows come back, and it was just like this really beautiful sequence of nature being nature. uh,
Mm.
and so why is that? Like, why do we have this innate desire to create chemically produced things instead of just following nature? Like, do you have an answer for that? Is it something that you see being talked about?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess well, it's happened over the last 50 years aggressively. You can tie things back to kind of the industrial war machine, of the first part of the 1900s, and the trying to make use of the chemicals in some of the big machines. The vision was really laid out because a whole, large network of independent family farmers wasn't efficient enough for growing populations. And this was Earl Butz, who was the Secretary of Ag in the Nixon administration, profoundly said that we were going to shift directions into a more efficient, quote unquote, corporate model. And then as we went through, by the end of the 70s, the kind of chickenization or the industrial chickenization system was being created. And, poor contracts were going to the kind of those first waves of farmers. So they're somewhat predatory as well. Somewhat might be an understatement. And it became mass production. And then through the 80s, of course, that was the end of the 70s, and the 80s became the farm crisis. There was a number of blunders. There was I think the Carter administration had an embargo in which they stopped shipping food to Russia during some of the tense conversations that were going on there. During the Reagan administration, there didn't seem to be much regard for the family farmer and a complete belief into the kind of Earl Butz mentality. And of course, there were high interest rates at that time. And so anyone who had invested in anything in the 70s, for land or equipment or infrastructure, and they had notes with the variable interest rate, many of them were lost. The pictures of the crosses in Washington, D.C. to mark all the farmer suicides during the 80s is pretty heartbreaking. There was standoffs in Nebraska and across the area. This is how Farm Aid, the concert was created, was to try to create more awareness and kind of crowdfund back in those days, that version for the family farmer structure and to become bigger advocates. But of course, I was born in late 79. So I grew up right in the mix of all this and saw it like really clearly. And our parents were really advocating for a fair price and less corporate consolidation at that time. By the end of my father's life, he just kind of felt like, they lost and what was all the work for. And it was kind of sad to see that, it come down to that because in the 90s, we started seeing what was termed the hog wars in Nebraska, where there was trying to be a severe weakening or no zoning. Local control was being taken away or stymied. But then ordinances came out that were actually trying to protect the more independent structure of farmers versus the big hog confinement systems that were coming into place at that time. And that was basically a setback, especially in the Nebraska legislature and other states that eliminated the ban on meatpacking monopolies from being able to feed animals. That was a ban on them doing it because it allowed farmers to be more competitive. Meatpacking's over here, farmers are over here. Now a big monopoly could do all of it, including create their own feed and then give a contract that shifted the liability onto the contract farmer or grower instead of on themselves. And then that routine has continued to grow bigger and bigger and bigger. So we have had and maybe it's another conversation because this could be lengthy, but we both at the national and our own state level in Nebraska, we've seen a deterioration of good governmental laws that allowed the farmers to not be as competitive, to become more controlled in the public health's ability to live kind of like that, just that really good lifestyle kind of go away. And with that, we've seen a socioeconomic decline across rural. And now we have a lack of young farmers, and we're wondering what we're going to do, kind of as the baby boomer generation transitions their land. Young people can barely afford the land now. And so now we got a crisis. And now we aren't producing, a lot of enough food fit for human consumption and giving a diverse array of nutrients and essential amino acids and different kinds of things that the body needs to, I think, get the most potential out of the way we think or our ability to move quicker, and do more things. We're giving ourselves the short end of the stick there as consumers in general, which is all of us. And so that's why it's just like so important right now to be able to talk about regenerative principles, but then actually look at the past, bring back some of those good governmental measures, because regulations can be good when they protect the public's health and they protect a healthy industry. But get that good government back and try to find ways to make the policy around this cool again. And since the numbers of farmers have been so depleted since the 80s, really, really working with you and with others across the country to try to figure out how we have a more informed consumer base, because it will be the consumers that will drive the next change that will help us have a more regenerative system. and it will be some of us farmers that are left over, very few young ones, but we will be there to help guide this and understand some of those metrics and how good government works, some of those provisions, and just how the day to day on the farm could work under a more regenerative system. So that's what I'm excited about, is being able to bring policy back, make it cool, and just have straight talk, and work with more and more folks that want to see their families and others be healthy, and come up with solutions for a lot of our problems, because we know what those solutions pretty much are. We know kind of the blueprint of how to get there, but we just need more people involved in this conversation, and we kind of need to operate as one, and just keep pushing on government to get better around this kind of stuff, because the next generation's health depends on it.
That is some of the most important information that people are going to hear today is what you just said. And I really appreciate you sharing that, and just like having your depth of knowledge around all these things, like shows how passionate and how much you really care about this. Uh, as a chef, things and okay, so as a chef who grew up growing my own food, raising hogs, raising a couple steer every year, hunting and fishing, like I I've never lived in a place that I couldn't go pick a tomato, or I couldn't go pick some fruit, or I couldn't go hunt a deer, or I couldn't, raise a hog. Like I've never experienced that. And I think that in the growth of America, there are so many people now that live in essentially, just concrete cities that have no connection whatsoever to their food source. I think that that's something, the conversation is finally starting to be a little bit more mainstream, where people are talking more in depth about, oh, get to know your farmer, like understand your farmer. And there's a lot more people like yourself creating organizations, participating in organizations that are, like you said, making farming cool again. Something that you said earlier that really resonates with me is that you're working with your neighbors. And I think that that's something that kind of the industrialization of farming took away from
Yep.
farmers. I mean, even from just small communities. I think overall, in general, we're so disconnected from our own communities in America anymore that, we don't know our neighbors, right? Like, and that to me is scary, because I know every single one of my neighbors that lives on my street. Like, I
Yeah.
know them all. And it's an important thing. It's like, I grow my own garden, and there's way more food grown in my little tiny third of an acre property that I can't do anything with it. So I give it to my neighbors and I share it with my neighbors. When you say you work with your neighbors, what does that look like for you guys? And how can, to me, like that's part of the solution, right? Is someone's growing, the legumes and the corn, and then overgrazing with cattle that your neighbor, has. Like, is that what that looks like for you guys?
Yeah, so on our farm, we have one neighbor, because once again, like my brother and I weren't really raised as cattlemen, or cowboys. Like, we're just straight kind of dirt farmers, right? So we're not great with large ruminant animals, but we kind of know that we need them. And so, but our farmer he's better, at handling large animals, and so we work with him and create like scenarios where he can be able to graze on our land, so he gets some of the benefits. Now, I want that to be more profound. We're not there yet, but like that's definitely an undertaking. And then another neighbor a little bit farther down the road, he's got chickens and pigs, and the pigs pasture naturally through the woods up on the lowest hills. And his chickens are out there just kind of pecking away all the time too. And this is on 14 acres as well. But outside of them, gleaning on the natural stuff in the area, our non-GMO white corn, which is food grade for humans, and goes into tortilla, right? It's also, being used for his animals that he's feeding out, butchering and feeding out to other people in the area. So, but we're kind of trying to recreate this, because the farmers really relied on themselves when they first got here. The net farmers were very networked, and now you see it more competitive. And maybe they don't want another farmer to have kind of that competitive edge. Not all are like that, but that certainly does exist around our area too. And so what I would like to see, if the regenerative vision comes true, is that we tool up the farm. And so when we look across the land, it's not just all corn. Maybe corn's still the cash crop, but you got rows of trees like in the like every 500 feet, that are stopping soil with the root structure. But we're growing stuff now up in the air, where we weren't, able to harvest anything at that level. So we're actually getting more food on that acre. And then all of a sudden animals are going through certain parts of the year. So instead of just corn all year, now you got the animals moving through, you got the trees. Now we have all these little unutilized places around the farm. And so, we're talking about a greenhouse. And of course, I mentioned that I planted like a couple small orchards. So we're utilizing all those areas. And no one can tell me that we're getting the most potential out of the feed the world model by just scaling up on genetics. We need to be better utilizers of all the space that we have on the land in order for us to be able to get there. So tool up the farms, allow us to raise these more biodiverse systems and bring young people back onto the farms who are creative, like who believe in this, want this kind of healthy lifestyle, and then work in the towns, the small towns around, or the cities as well, because they're going to be where the consumer bases are, to be able to develop the supplements, the biologicals that are natural biologicals that we could be implementing into the farm more and more than the synthetic nutrients over time to help stimulate a living soil. The processors who could be more independent local processors for meat, but all kinds of meat, and not stopping at meat, but also processing the fruits, the nuts, the berries, the small grains, the legumes, so that that's more accessible to people in Portland or in Omaha or wherever you may be. So if we tool up the farms, we're naturally going to redevelop and reclaim that socioeconomic status, or a more equal type setting of that. And that's what we want to see, is more of this like a community feel, as it really once was out there, working together, bringing all our skills together, allowing the farms to be tooled up in a more biodiverse way, creating markets around that, and then developing the more localized and regional infrastructure so we can get it to the markets. And then you have a better national security plan too. Should like there be storms, or even kind of global spats with foreign adversaries, or whatever could happen in the future that could surprise us, we at least have the local system set up so we have a more food secure system, and we can continue on the up and ups no matter what challenges we face in the world. And once again, just getting that full potential out of our little blip in life, as well.
Heck yeah, dude. Like community is key with all of it, in my opinion. I mean, so the thing that always kind of I can't comprehend in my own mind is like when I go to, again, like I'm blessed to live where I live, because in Portland we're a small city that has a big city feel, but I could drive to the rancher that raises lamb that I eat. He's 30 minutes away.
Mm-hmm.
I can drive to where I'm going to get some grass fed beef. It's 3 hours away. Still, like within reason, I could drive out to the coast. I could get fresh fish. Like
Mm-hmm.
my perspective on what this really looks like is totally skewed because I live in such a place.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that when I go to farmers markets and I see farmers that are all growing the same things, it kind of
Yep.
drives me nuts, because I'm like, guys, you're competing against yourself. Now, if you get together and someone that like Barbara, you're really good at, you've got a great landscape for these fruit trees, grow fruit trees, sell
Mm-hmm.
fruit. Bob, you've got the perfect setup for zucchini and squash. Like, go get crazy. Like, instead of focusing on their strengths, they're just kind of like throwing a giant net out there, and then they just wind up overlapping each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't seem to make sense in my brain. Like in my brain, it's just like, okay, so one person, you're going to grow this, and you're going to raise cattle, and you're going to do chickens, and your strength is this. And now let's all see how we can cooperate together, independently together, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it blows me away that we can't quite get there yet. How much? So I'm going to change gears. Like how
Mm-hmm.
much produce in America do you think that we ship overseas? I don't have an answer. I talked to last week. I had Port Orford Sustainable Seafood, some fisheries that are here
Mm-hmm.
in Oregon. They're doing a really cool thing, and we were talking about how much fish gets caught in American, on the Oregon coast in particular, and then shipped to Asia, processed, and then shipped back. And that to me made no sense. But what you're touching on there in that last statement is like bringing those processors that are able to process all these things in one place and making it again like the smaller impact that produces a greater amount of food that's more nutrient dense. But yeah, how much do we ship overseas? Like, is there a lot that goes out, or how much are we really eating here? Do you know?
Yeah, so the problem is, in my opinion, to kind of get at this, is that we've incorporated once again bad policy. And an example would be these massive kind of global trade agreements that devalue our products and then depend more on the government to subsidize kind of one stream of products so that it becomes a lower value, lower quality too food supply. So those trade agreements are creating systems where food's going to from South America to Mexico to the U.S., and taking these big like end arounds that is not efficient, is not food security, and you don't have as high a quality of product, and that's what our government is like subsidizing, and that's what our policy allows us to do for low cost food. Now you can see when like COVID-19 hit, it was a disruption, right? It shook the supply chain, and so food started not popping up on shelves. And Tyson's CEO was saying, "Oh, we're about going to have to take food off the shelves in America," but there was going to be food on the shelves in other countries at that time. So all of a sudden, like we were going to be the ones that had food off the shelves because our system let the food at last stop at that place. So this is just silly. It doesn't make any sense. But that is like what our government is asking us to do right now, and what our trade agreements have asked us to do. So in Nebraska, so we have all this like high producing land, for example. We import 90% of our food into Nebraska, and only, yeah, that's edible, right? Almost everything is used for an export commodity to Asia. Now, there's other countries that are partners, right? Mexico, Canada, but in Asia, those are really our three big like trade partners. So we're pumping in food that isn't from here. We're taking everything that we can grow under a uniform system, and we're moving it, overseas or across country borders, and we're not getting any value of that. So we would like to just simply say, let's start with 10%, because if we made that an 80-20 deal where 20% of that is us growing our own food in the area, that would have a huge impact to the not just like people having access, but to rural economies that have been pretty busted up as well. So I think it's like is we're wasting a lot of food. We don't utilize it as good once it actually gets to the place either. A lot of that is not being utilized, very well in that. So it's an inefficient system we've just created all the way around, and the results are that we're shipping a bunch away, and we're not producing enough for our own selves, and then we're bringing stuff back in, and it's not an efficient system. It's costly to subsidize that, but you have big, powerful companies at the top. And I mentioned Tyson, so I'll just pick on them for a little bit, for instance, who want those agreements because of that cash money. And so, they weren't giving basic benefits during COVID to first line essential workers or on the line essential workers that were getting sick. But they were able to, one of the companies, not Tyson, invested in a big ballpark in the town instead, of just helping those frontline workers. And we were all seeing that we were starting to on the fringe of experiencing shortages at mass levels in the grocers. So we got to know our farmer again. We got to create that relationship, and the policies we need to develop need to be work around like tooling up that farm system, and then doing market development so that we can have the ability to actually grow in a way that is going to help get the nutrients to the people around us. We've completely eliminated that, and there's strong correlations on how that's led to diabetes and increased obesity and other issues that many of us face.
Yeah, I don't think that people understand how important the roots really are. I mean, another thing that drives me absolutely mad, and I get a lot of flack in the chef community about this because I I almost refuse to cook non-seasonally. So I don't, if I don't grow enough tomatoes, I grow enough tomatoes in my backyard that I can
Yeah.
almost 20 pounds of tomatoes. And that
Yeah.
20 pounds of tomatoes is going to last me for a long time. Like I grow almost 175 heads of garlic in my little, backyard throughout the fall and in the spring. I've got onions and I've got potatoes, sweet potatoes. Like I've got all these things that like I grow specifically to the season and then I utilize. So a lot of my chef friends make fun of me because they're like, "Oh, here comes chef and his brown food again." Because like this time of year, a lot of my food is just brown. Like it's braised elk, it's
Yep.
grilled venison, it's braised chicken thighs. Like it's all dark colors. And then, now I start to see some stuff. I can start picking some of my microgreens and my nasturtiums are going to start blossoming. So I can put some flowers on a plate and like things start to look a little bit more pretty. But I don't think that the overall American realizes how good we have it in being able to export a lot of these, import a lot of these fruits and vegetables. In my opinion, I think that if we all agreed that we were going to eat seasonally and locally, 90% of our problems would go away. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, no, I do think,
Yes.
and I do think that, and I would also say that in order to do that, we would have to farm more regeneratively as a whole, and that is to be able to allow more of the wild game to have habitat to come back. Because in our area, it's been very depleted with the kind of fence post to fence post, style of farming. And my test case on this, or case study on this, is that over the last 5 years, we have Nebraska split up into squares and it gets divided in all kinds of different ways. But we have five squares that are 160 acres each that we farm. And we put 2 acres on each square, just let like kind of nature grow it as it wanted to. We sprinkled some seeds in and stuff like that too, so that we would have a diverse mix. But and then we left it alone. And when we were harvesting, the corn or the beans at the end of the year, in the fall, we all of a sudden are seeing, pheasants flying out of all those like little areas and, running through the rows as, we're taking out the corn. They were coming back. So just in a few year span of just taking 2 acres, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, so about 10 acres total, right, out of nearly 800 acres, in every field, all of a sudden the pheasants were back, the birds were back. And so it will take that cooperation with the farmer in order and better policies to move us more into all towards that safe regenerative transition. And then we're going to have more abilities to be more seasonal in our approaches, which is how it's always intended to be and how, others before us always had to live. They had mastered that. We've lost that connection. But it will take a large overall effort to get back there. It's really exciting to see that this stuff works through our personal experiences. It brings joy to my heart when we're seeing a lot of turkeys and pheasants around the place. But now we need more habitat, so there's more deer back in the area too. We don't have a lot of deer. That's different than when I was young, and so that's just a symptom of a problem. We're just going to have to kind of strap up and be a little bit more focused on going about this, in the next couple decades.
That's amazing. So, were pheasant thought of as kind of like a pest bird for a lot of these farmers? Like, were they killing crops? Like, and then just the lack of habitat kind of depleted their numbers, and now they're coming back as you start to see these like rewilding of areas.
People love pheasants. It's a symbol of our area and of our culture. They're unique to our area, but just the pulling out their habitat has endangered them, and so I think people like them. My grandparents' age, they all cooked pheasant. When they had hunt, and so now there's just not a lot of them around the area. So it's about the way we've chosen to farm this, decrease the habitat. Even if people still really like them or identify with them in our culture, they're not as prominent as they used to be. And another good example would be the prairie chicken. So chickens, we didn't really have those. In the plains.
Yeah.
My friends from I have a friend that's farming with the tree range chicken label up in Minnesota, and he's from Guatemala. And he would always tell me, he's like chicken, Graham, chickens are a jungle species, so we're going to recreate a jungle atmosphere, even though we're here in Minnesota, and that's where hazelnuts and elderberries and different things create that kind of jungle atmosphere for the chicken. But it's prairie chickens in the prairie, and that's what the indigenous people used to harvest, and there's no prairie chickens in our area. I'm sure there's one hiding somewhere, but I've never seen a prairie chicken in our area in our life. And my generation, my age is probably the first generation to never get to see a prairie chicken in our area. There are some further out in some areas that are a little bit more wild in Nebraska for sure, but they're so rare and hard to come by now. And so, once again, just 2 acres on every 160 would be an amazing start to being able to return that habitat. And I think our culture would definitely go for that. And I know, the gamers out there and the hunters out there, that they would appreciate that. It's a win-win for everybody when we can create that opportunity.
That's amazing. So just that small amount has allowed this animal that has existed here for a long, long time to come back and exist. I know it's not going to be a reality, but what I would like is to have a video of you seeing your first prairie chicken when it comes back. Like I can't put
That'd be cool.
into words good enough what I know that experience for you will be like, and I have hope that that's going to happen in your lifetime, and I think that's pretty fucking cool.
Yeah, that'd be a great way to that'd be a great telling of the times, and I will think that I'll be able to look back and know that we've had some victories if we see that day.
It really is. And I think that what you guys are moving towards and how you're not only impacting your specific land use, but also encouraging others to do the same. I think that bringing back these habitats is really going to allow nature to be nature while also existing. And I think that that's, again, the human in us is like, we are the greatest thing. But the reality is nature is always going to be the greatest thing. And nature is always going to be what we need to strive towards instead of push away.
Yeah.
I yeah, I can't, just like, I love that so much. Like, I can't get over the fact that 2 acres, a total of 10 acres has made this huge difference for you guys. Like, that's
Yeah.
wild to me. And I hope that people continue to move forward with that.
Yeah, last
Um,
year, every field we harvested, we had birds flying out of it, and we had not had that happen since we were little. So, pretty cool
that's amazing,
on
dude.
that little bit of habitat.
Like, that's spectacular. I would love to know about your participation with Regenerate Nebraska. So you're not only focusing on yours, but you're also helping to promote a bigger picture and try to get other people on the same, getting people in the same boat as you guys. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, so it started out back I had a lucky chance, only time I've been to Europe, but I got kind of scholarshiped out to Europe to be an advocate for farmers in the middle of the country when the global climate talks were expanding to encompass farmers as a key part of that, of a climate solution, actually. And so I met a lot of interesting people from all over the globe that were coming at this from different landscapes. And when got back to Nebraska, went and had some kitchen table kind of conversations, some gatherings or meetings amongst farmers, and we talked about this. And some of them were already practitioners, others weren't, but everyone kind of agreed that our culture has really taken a hit from the industry moving in and having more control over what we do on the day to day, and that regenerative agriculture really is a solution that fits our culture and that we could all kind of rally around. But it was also mentioned by a few that we needed to go, as farmers and rural people, we needed to go talk to other people out there. And so we spent a year in that inception in 2017 area, and we went to tribal communities and talked about regenerative ag, food and nutrition, food sovereignty, We went into the inner cities areas, and we also listened to a variety of groups and residents that lived in those areas, and it was fascinating because it showed us that everybody was thinking about food, nutrition, how it impacts them, how it reflects on their own personal cultures, and everybody was really concerned about it. And for so many years, I'd felt like nobody cared about agriculture or farming, and I think there's an awakening going on where people are drawing back to that, as we talked about earlier. But then we used what we heard, had a few other kind of like big events initially, which brought together other perspectives within those kind of rural, urban, and tribal areas, and then developed like an overall statement for our state being wholly regenerative, and that allowed a space to come in because of the listening and the translating this into the overall mission of Regenerate Nebraska. A trust level and working relationships in areas that haven't been working together enough historically, and maybe then became more susceptible to industry pressures to really kind of take effect and impact us in our own different little ways and different perspectives from wherever like we may be, even though it's in the same part of the country. So that was a profound experience, is listening and learning, and then taking that into action. And then that allowed us to create more cohesive relationships where we can actually start forming and developing programs in order to help get more young people on the land, or help an existing farmer transition safely into, because there's risks in this, learning new things, into a regenerative operation, or being able to bring folks together from two different perspectives, part of the supply chain versus farming, or even a nonprofit group with a mission that is general but believes in this. And it all of a sudden allows us to kind of go into all these different spaces and learn from ourselves, even though we're in the same region of the country, and also be able to show young people that are aspiring or inspired by these kind of conversations to form different kinds of relationships, sometimes even mentorships that can help them be a part of our evolving farm team. We're getting more young people, even if they're not the farmer, they may want to be able to brew up a batch of like biologicals that feeds the living soil. That might be what their passion ends out. And so the network has really allowed us to kind of all evolve, and then as a block be able to I think talk about these issues more openly, and then once again reconstruct like some of the damage that has been done around these solutions, and then just allow more inroads or pathways for more people to be a part of these conversations that traditionally might not. And then once again forming a bigger farm team so that our state can be a guiding factor, or be role models out there, but also be able to connect with our friends from other states so that we can in the future hopefully do a better job of expanding the local and regional marketplace that we depleted as the industry gained such a stronghold and captured our government as well.
Heck yeah, dude. So you guys are just like, you are not do as I say, you are do as I do. Let me show you how. And then you're showing up, you're asking questions, you're listening to other people. It's the most collaborative effort that could possibly exist. And it sounds like it's moving forward in a great way. I can't believe we're close. We're past my hour mark. And so I don't want to take up too much of your day, because I know you got stuff to do. What are three takeaways that the average consumers, I think that, like you said earlier, is at the end of the day, like, this comes down to consumer practices, and we have to make better decisions as consumers. What are three things that consumers can do to improve or help to move industry towards regenerative?
Mm-hmm. Well, the first one we had identified, which is know your farmer. And so I'm going to clump bits and pieces of this together. But when you can't access from a farmer you directly know, try to find places where you can purchase from that do have some transparency to, where this product would came from. So you're actually just tracking like just beyond what you see in the supermarket. We try to use supermarkets to supplement what we can't get. And then that becomes an organic label supplementation where possible to minimize some of the chemical impacts. But start with know your farmer. It might take a little time to orient yourself around how everything works and where the access points are in your own community. But here in Nebraska, we have ways to do it. And it's ultimately about feeling comfortable with those people that are producing your food and supporting them as much as possible. So that's the first one. The second one would be thinking about farm programming and thinking about the political side of it. Let's make it cool again. Let's make it fun. Let's make it about like our future's health, of both ourselves, and our families, but also around the ecological side of things, so that all these beneficial birds, insects, and for sportsmanship, that we have the abilities to actually be more seasonal. So, and the big policy piece is the farm bill, right? And trying to get that back into an approach where it's de-risking a transition to regenerative agriculture and creating more transparency between the consumer and the farmer, instead of, and this is a very generalized because this is a Goliath piece of legislation and we can dive into it deeper on another conversation, but getting engaged in that farm bill and advocating to your federal representatives and even at the state level that we find ways to promote that safe transition for the farmer. We don't want farmers to go broke trying to do the transition. We need them to have the guidance they need, and we need a careful transition, and we need an inroad for the young people. So taking those principles, putting them into that, along with regenerative principles, and infusing them into the farm bill and other kinds of programs. That we also talked about trade. And then I would also say that as the third one, try to think indigenous, like indigenous people did. They had a positive influence on my ancestors. It's not always the story you hear, but they literally helped us build the first sod house, helped us get around, and so and helped us understand like some of these regenerative principles in the first generation of Christiansens. And so think in that way. How am I going to better work, myself and my lifestyle to fall into those principles where I can work within the ecosystem as I'm garnering food, or just even as I'm going through that day life. Listen to the tribal people, the tribal elders. They have stories. Their principles are still strong. There is a lot of wisdom in that knowledge. And of course, I've seen a lot of the tribes around here going back into really, really advocating that their own tribal members are growing things that are native, that were more natural to their past diets, and getting away from that, which has caused them as well to have higher rates of diabetes, obesity, etc. So we're learning these things from the tribe. So I'd say like the third one is try to think like from a more indigenous perspective, instead of trying to think kind of like what we've done in the last couple generations, which is, okay, we got a problem, let's human re-engineer it. That's what's causing catastrophe. Instead, if we can take some notes from those who worked in a way for thousands of years that worked within the ecosystem, we can use modern technologies and ideas as long as we hold true to that principle. We can use some tech. We can use some, machines to be able to do even maybe better than they could have in certain situations, or better than some of my generational ancestors could have. But try to put yourself in a mindset and look through the eyes of them who were able to do a lot better job than we have in the present. So those would be my three things to kind of leave you with. And then I also want to note, I also remembered gooseberries and black currants. The ancestors had infused those. The native people were also utilizing those crops. So those are some notes that my ancestors had taken, because I can see in some of our wooded areas where they had planted strategically, these different kinds of varieties. And I'm trying to get better at gathering those products. But the squirrels and the rabbits, they know where those plants are even better than me sometimes, and they beat me to it every single year. And so I'm trying to get better at that, and I would like to try to get some of those seeds and save them and kind of propagate more of them too. But man, this has been awesome, and it's been really good to meet you over the last few months and get to know you. And love it when people want to talk about these kind of things. Thank you. And thank you for what you're trying to do as a chef as well, to help more people become aware of those the senses, right? the touch, the texture, the taste, the smells. Because when you allow that to come back in the fray, you're like, wait, why was I eating this box processed food? You're gonna go find places around people that are doing more of what you're doing, or support farmers, like us. They're trying to figure out how we can meet the consumer somewhere in the middle. Thank you.
Oh man, it's my pleasure, and likewise. Baseball has brought baseball has brought more cool people into my network, in my world, than I ever
For
could
real.
have imagined. And who would have thought that playing a couple baseball games in Las Vegas would have brought us together? And I mean, it was fun to hijack the conversation that night, and nobody really knew what was going on. They were trying to jump in, and we were just like deep in it. And I'm like, because
Yeah.
when you find folks that are like-minded, you find people that are passionate about what they do. Like, I just want to listen. I just want to hear. I just want to know more. And I am going to take this, and I'm going to make time to get involved with more of the farmers in my area, because I think that I'm still slightly disconnected, in the sense that I don't participate in the overall community, and I think that I can do better at that. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to follow your lead here, and I'm going to work my way into it, because I think that this is the answer to solving a lot of our problems, from health and eco and world situations. Where can people learn more about you? How can we support you? How can we, just help create awareness in what we do? You got socials, websites?
Yep. Yeah, I have socials, more personal, an Instagram that just be under my name, Graham Christensen, and X, which I don't use as much, but still on it time to time. Regenerate Nebraska also has a Facebook and an Instagram page where you can keep up on things going on there. And then there's another business that really kind of works on connecting the more industrial system and that transition over into the space. It might get more into the policy side outside of just kind of the ecological solutions that Regenerate Nebraska offers. So it's more mechanical in that sense. And that would be GC Resolve, which has a Facebook, an Instagram, as well as an X. So there's a number of places to connect with us. And yeah, we welcome across the country, connecting with more and more folks, so we can learn as well, but so we can kind of share what's going on, in the good life here in Nebraska.
I love it. I can't wait to get out there. I know for a fact it's not going to be this year. It might be this year, but I am definitely coming out there next year,
You got an
2026.
invite, man. We'll put it together. We'll be thrilled to invite you out to the center of the country and show you some really cool things.
I'm stoked. I cannot wait. Graham, thank you so much. I'm going to include where to find these things in the show notes, folks. So if you didn't catch it when we were talking, check the notes. They'll be there. Graham, thank you so much for sharing your passion with us, man. I greatly appreciate it, and I do look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise.
All right, brother. Y'all have a great day.
You too.
That's it for this episode of Here From Where. Thanks for tuning in, and if you enjoyed the conversation, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. A huge thanks to Justin Podolesky for the music and sound production, and until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep moving forward. All the best, and happy cooking.